This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Listening to this podcast? Smart move. Being financially savvy? Smart move. Another smart move? Having State Farm help you create a competitive price when you choose to bundle home and auto. Bundling, just another way to save with the personal price plan. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptations. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. In this week's episode, I'm excited to continue our conversation from part 1 of our season 2 Q&A and answer some more questions that had been submitted to me from listeners and people over on Instagram and TikTok and Threads. And there's so many great questions in here that I've tried to break them up into categories, similarly to the first half of this Q&A. In this week's episode, we have lots to discuss, so many things to touch upon, and I really am excited for a lot of these questions to be answered in season 2, but want to preface first and foremost with the fact that there will be a lot of spoilers in this episode for The Long Game and some of the other books in the Game Changer series. So if you haven't read the other books or The Long Game ahead of season 2, then this episode is not going to be for you because we will be spoiling a lot. The second is that Jacob Tierney has spoken to numerous publications and been interviewed countless times, and he is very much of the opinion that fan input is not going to be taken heavily into account when he is writing season 2. So everything that I am speculating and commenting on is purely for fun. And like many people who are fans of the show, I will be happy with whatever he turns out. I trust in his vision, and he plans to approach season 2 the same way he did season 1. And for that, I am very excited. So this is my version of events and how I would approach things just based on how season 1 was shot and composed and written. And if it doesn't look like this, I'm going to be okay with that. So again, this is purely for fun, speculative, and I'm excited to see if I'm right about any of it, but I will be perfectly okay if I'm wrong about all of it. And season 2 is a masterpiece that I didn't see coming, because season 1 certainly was that. So the first question that I wanted to touch upon was, how do I think the first episode will start? What do I think we will see in the very beginning of season 2? And that question excited me a lot because I'd been thinking about that on my own. And I personally think we will replicate season 1's first scene, where we are dropped into a moment between Shane and Ilya. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's back at the cottage in the aftermath of their dinner with Shane's parents. So I think we will get the proper ending of the Heated Rivalry book before we jump forward in time. And there's enough left in the book that Jacob can include a good 5 or 10 minute scene to open the season and reestablish to all of us what happens at the end of that book, despite the happy ending of season 1. At that moment in the story, there are still a lot of concerns on Shane's part, whereas Ilya has just had the best day of his life. And I think it's important to establish that disconnect between them early, because it is a theme of the entire Long Game book. Second to that, per the timeline, Ilya signs with Ottawa that summer, and then that fall is the season when Shane comes out to his teammates and tells them that he is gay, which is October of 2018, which Jacob has already touched upon filming that and shooting that because it is handled off page in the book, but Jacob thinks that's too important of a moment to not show on screen, and I agree with that assessment. This is also going to be an important narrative payoff, because when it's discovered later on that Ilya and Shane are together and his team finds out about that, you want to be able to refer back to the moment when Shane told them that he was gay. So that is important, and that takes place in that liminal space between Heated Rivalry and the long game. But I think we will get an adaptation or a new original scene that Jacob's writing for that moment in the story. Then that November is when Hayden finds out about Shane and Ilya. And I would personally love if Jacob adapts the entirety of the My Dinner with Hayden scene, because there is so much within it that would lay the perfect foundation for the season. Primarily a conversation between Shane and Ilya that happens after the night ends, where Shane is upset that they can't love each other freely like Hayden and Jackie. And that moment also reestablishes how the relation feels for us viewers now that they are in a committed relationship, because the dynamic is going to be different. And we got a glimpse of it in episode 6, but it will be very different in season 2. And the earlier that can be established, the better, I think. And I also feel it's important to introduce Hayden and his family early on, because they're going to be important throughout the season as well. And showing us the dynamic between Ilya and Hayden is pivotal too, and something Jacob has expressed he's very excited to write, because not only is it going to be humorous and funny, but there is a really important emotional payoff later on in the show that can't happen if we're not invested in Hayden and Ilya and Shane's dynamic early on. The next part that I think they need to cover takes place in the epilogue, and that's when Shane and Ilya announce the Arena Foundation, which also takes place that same month. And a side piece of information that they can include there is that Wyatt is also traded to Ottawa, and Ilya attends a funeral with Ryan Price for a player named Duncan Harvey, who had unfortunately lost his battle with mental health. And I think this is a scene that sort of has to be included, or at the very least mentioned, because of Ilya's character arc in season 2. And perhaps Ilya and Shane talk about how that funeral was, if we don't actually get to see him attend the funeral with Ryan. But that is also when Ilya invites Ryan to coach at the Game Changers camp. So it feels like it would be a great on-screen moment or opportunity. And then we have the first year of the Game Changers camp, which a lot of new characters are introduced then, and it's in tandem with the same span of time between Heated Rivalry and the beginning of the long game, and that encapsulates Tough Guy and Common Goal and those two books. I have a feeling we'll only see the second year, which is what happens at the beginning of the long game. I think that we will get very little screen time for those characters, but a lot of exposition for those books. And Ilya also gets his loon tattoo in that gap between Heated Rivalry and the long game. So if Jacob does choose to skip the ending of Heated Rivalry and the moments I just listed out, which take place between the two books, I don't think he will, but he might, then he may dump us right into the beginning of the long game, where this time has already passed, and instead of showing us on screen everything that has happened in that span of time, we would get dialogue between Shane and Ilya to explain that contextually. And we would drop into the scene where they are telling their agent about their relationship in the summer of 2020. They can use that conversation to give us all the context if need be, but I personally don't think that would be as gripping of a scene to reintroduce the show. And if that's the case, then we will jump into the second annual Game Changers camp, where Ryan Price has already caught Shane and Ilya kissing. We would get more Yuna. We would get Shane and Ilya at the beginning of the episode already established as a couple. And then in the back half of the episode, we could include Shane and Ilya going to dinner with Ryan and Fabian, or attending Fabian's concert together. And I think that would be a good way to establish their relationship dynamics if we're not going to get the My Dinner with Hayden scene. And also a gauge on how each of them are feeling at the beginning of the season, so that it's clear as to why they are not exactly on the same page, and establishes Ilya's headspace and how they are not communicating well. The next question I got was, what is my guesstimate as to how much will be covered in each episode of season 2? And this is a hard one to answer, because the way each episode could be structured is different. It doesn't all have to follow the same template. But if we want to pace everything properly, I'd assume that each episode may cover as little as a few weeks up to a couple of months. And some episodes might zero in on a day or two and make the majority of the episode cover those heavy moments and condense the in-between times. So for example, we might get a longer scene covering the Pride game and the aftermath of it between Shane and Ilya, and then condense the timeline around the Pride game. So a lot of the playoff run, etc. The next question I got is, do I have any thoughts on the episode names? So I definitely think we will get a song title used as an episode name again, or at least I hope Jacob has a song in mind for some of the bigger moments in the season that he can use in a big way. But otherwise, Jacob names the episodes very simply. Rookies, Olympians, Hunter, Rose, The Cottage. They're all quite simple and point blank, so I'd suspect that if one large story beat, like the Pike kids' wedding, they might use a name like something like Honeymoon, which refers to the book, because Shane and Ilya go home and they say, is this our honeymoon? Or if the other big story beat is when their relationship is revealed, it might be titled something like The Commissioner or something like that. Simple and to the point. And for the Troy and Harris standalone, if we get one, part of me feels like that episode might cover more of Troy before he arrives to Ottawa, like I said in part 1 of this Q&A. And if that's the case, then maybe the episode is called Dallas or something, and they use it to tell the story of the league or Dallas and give us sort of a window into the framework that Shane and Ilya are so worried about, because in the first season, they didn't go into too much detail about that and the mentality of the league. And Jacob might maintain that distance from the subject matter like Rachel did, but who knows? I'll take what I can get. But I'm willing to suspect that the titles are going to be 1 or 2 words each, very simple, and mimic that of season 1. But I like the title The Commissioner. I feel like that would be appropriate. But all of the titles from season 1 are sort of broad brush. So Rookies, Olympians, Hunter, Rose, The Cottage. So maybe The Commissioner is too specific, or Dallas is too specific. So hard for me to say. But I like Honeymoon too, or The Wedding. I think that would be really sweet if we got that. The next question I got is, which scenes of Ilya in other books do I want in season 2? I think from the jump, the one I really would love to see is the funeral scene between Ilya and Ryan. But I'd also like to see the scenes from the Kingfisher Bar, which I think we will certainly get. And there's also the scene between Ilya and Troy when they're in New York and they come out to one another. And I think we're definitely going to get that one. So if they combine that with Ilya clocking Eric.
This episode is brought to you by Peloton. Break through the busiest time of year with the brand new Peloton Cross-Training Tread Plus. Powered by Peloton IQ. With real-time guidance and endless ways to move, you can personalize your workouts and train with confidence, helping you reach your goals in less time. Let yourself run, lift, sculpt, push, and go. Explore the new Peloton Cross-Training Tread Plus at onepeloton.com.
My day kicks off with a refreshing Celsius energy drink, then straight to the gym. Pre-K pickup, back home to meal prep. Time for my fire station shift. One more Celsius, gotta keep the lights on. When the 3-alarm hits, I'm ready. Celsius. Live, fit, go. Grab a cold, refreshing Celsius at your local retailer or locate now at Celsius.com.
And loop his book and story into it that way. That works for me. If I think they're going to add some new scenes between him and Hayden, which it sounds like they might, I'd be thrilled. And Jacob sounds very excited to write those. But to me, those 3 feels like enough to satisfy the crossover and not take away from the moments in the long game. And I feel like we will probably get a lot of the moments of Ilya showing up in Role Model just because they're happening in tandem with the events of the long game. So they don't necessarily feel like moments of him popping up in another book per se, because it's part of his story too, and it would be expanding upon things we already know are happening and will happen in the long game. The next question I got was, how do I think Hudson will handle reciting Russian? And in the book, Shane is learning Russian. So if Hudson is also learning Russian for the show, I think it will feel really authentic. And I'm excited for those details. And also to see Connor portray how Ilya feels about Shane learning Russian with his face acting, because it will need to convey all of the internal thoughts and feelings that we read for Ilya in the story that he doesn't say out loud per se. I think we will also probably get a lot of subtext of this, maybe by inserting a scene or two of Shane listening to a Russian podcast in his car or on a plane ride, maybe even just seeing it on his phone, so that the viewer has that backstory that Shane's been teaching himself Russian, and it doesn't need to be called out explicitly for us. But whether or not they want to spend the time creating a small scene or a shot like that is doubtful. So I think it will show up as small teaching moments where Ilya calls Shane something ridiculous and he tries to guess what the word is, just like in the book. And I think Hudson will do a really good job conveying the struggle of learning the language, because he will be feeling the struggle himself as an actor. The next question is, do I think Ilya and Svetlana's relationship will grow colder? How will they justify the big reveal? And I've shared thoughts on this before, and I lean towards them not growing colder, but rather the physical distance between them leading to a normal amount of separation. But because Svetlana knows Ilya is in love with a man already, I don't think she'll be going quietly. I do think that the conversation of why Ilya is moving to Ottawa is going to have to happen before the move actually takes place. And then I think she will hopefully be getting a job in the league with another team, maybe keep her with Boston like she is in the book. And she'll check in with Ilya, but Ilya pulls away due to his depression. And that to me feels far more impactful because they are so close and he's not confiding in her or Shane or anyone who's on the inside and retreating further into himself. And I think that's another way to narratively convey that something is really wrong with him if he's not confiding in the two closest people to him. And I think that will be effective storytelling. The next question I got is, since they've changed Svetlana's role in the show, do I think Ilya will be as depressed and alone in season 2? And my answer is yes, because it's central to the storyline and it is the tension of the entire season. The fact that he's struggling with his mental health and cannot and will not let Shane see it or help him with it is massively important. And I think, like I said before, Ilya distancing from Svetlana as well as Shane will double down on this notion of his self-isolation and come up in his therapy sessions with Galina, probably. And perhaps Svetlana's words and advice, in addition to Galina's, can help him to be brave and admit that something is wrong to Shane and encourage him to let Shane in, because we got to see how Svetlana's words were a big impetus for Ilya calling Shane before the Russian monologue scene in season 1. So I suspect she might be used in a similar way in season 2. The next question is, do I think the writers will let Shane correct Hayden for being an Ilya hater? Probably. I think we'll get some sort of scene, just like in the book, where he calls out people for their behavior, specifically Hayden and JJ, who are upset that Shane had lied to them, and they can't understand that their behavior is exactly why Shane felt obligated to lie. And neither of them spoke of Ilya highly ever. So Shane never felt like they would fully understand or accept that he loved him. And that manifests just as Shane had suspected. So I hope that we get the My Dinner with Hayden scene, because within that, Shane calls out both Hayden and Ilya for their childish behavior. And while it can be used as a humorous moment between Ilya and Hayden, it's also an important one for Shane, because he gets to voice his feelings to the two men that he values and wants to also establish boundaries now that Hayden knows about Shane and Ilya. And that's so important before the rest of the season kicks off, because Hayden is harboring their secret now too. So they need to have those types of conversations and air out the dirty laundry. And I think that doing it over the My Dinner with Hayden scene is the perfect environment for them to do that. And there's already dialogue written that would reflect that conversation as well. The next question I got is, what do I think a dinner with Rose, Svetlana, Shane, and Ilya would look like? That is a dream for season 2. I think this is so fun to think about. I believe it would probably take place before their wedding, because everyone would be coming to town for that. And I think Rose and Svetlana would be so excited to finally meet the boyfriend of their best friend and also their close friend. And at first, I think it would kind of bubble over with Rose. I think she'd be more outwardly excited about this, and Svetlana would probably be more protective at first and spend the first couple of minutes sussing out Shane. And then once she determines that Shane is harmless and endlessly devoted to Ilya, she'd be able to focus on Rose and get to know her properly. And those two characters are ones that we know can have fun. So I think if Shane in particular was worried about them meeting, the two of them would bulldoze right through that fear and get a couple drinks in everyone and start swapping stories about their best guy friends and when they both knew they were in love with someone else. And Shane and Ilya would basically be hearing their love story told back to them through the eyes of Svetlana and Rose, and the things that they thought they were being so secretive about that these two women clocked right away, which would be quite funny. And I think just like Rose spearheaded her and Shane's friendship dynamic, she'd probably ask for everyone's numbers at the end of the night. And when she says, let's keep in touch, she'd mean it, and she'd create a group chat while driving home. The next question is, Jacob has confirmed he's writing Shane's coming out moment with the team. Where do you see that slotting in? So canonically, he comes out to his team at the beginning of the story because it takes place between the end of Heated Rivalry and the beginning of the long game. So early on in the timeline. But I'd say there are two moments. The first is when he tells his team that he's gay, and the second is when they find out that he's in a relationship with Ilya. And I suspect he'll include both. So one at the very beginning, and the second will probably be in the second to last episode, if I had to predict that. I think in episode 1, it probably will fall closer to the end of the episode, and it's going to be used as a narrative callback that they will need to have established for that secondary moment when his team accuses Shane of letting Ilya score in the playoffs. So I think it will be at the end of episode 1 for when he tells his team he's gay, and then probably in the second to last episode when that confrontation with his team where he owns up to the fact that yes, him and Ilya are in a relationship. I think that will happen in the penultimate episode. This next question is, I'm curious on your thoughts as to how season 2 will address Shane's macrobiotic diet, and if you think it will be explored as an eating disorder as so many readers interpret, or whether it will remain a performance-enhancing diet as Rachel Reed stated before. Is there a route you hope the show takes over the other? Do you think season 1 planted the seeds for this to be further explored in season 2? So I've talked about this in another Q&A episode, and my spin on it is that it's very important for everybody to keep in mind that Shane and Ilya are professional athletes, and they have access to trainers and nutritionists and people whose entire job it is to make sure that they are being fueled properly and can perform at their best every night. So a lot of Shane's viewpoints on nutrition are going to come from those conversations he'd be already having with his trainers and nutritionists on the team. And I think the added layer of that is that Shane is someone who loves control in all areas of his life because control makes him feel safe. And so food naturally is an extension of that. And we see him exhibiting that control through this diet that he goes on. And in the long game, he actually has a really important conversation with Rose where he says that he might be drawn to exhibiting discipline because of how it makes him feel mentally, more so than how eating the food makes him feel physically better. And so he's quoted saying, I like to practice discipline and self-control and be rewarded for that. That's all. So to me, this can be broken down further given his personality, and it can be interpreted as him needing routines and structure to feel safe and regulated. And we know that in the long game, he feels out of control in a few areas of his life. And so he would lean further into that regulation as a way to feel self-soothing or give himself a sense of consistency and structure. And that reward aspect is more of a way to have measurable data of how he's being rewarded. So if he eats better, he might play better. And with the food, he's trying to use that food to improve his performance. Yes, but he's also aging. They're going to be 30, and that's where players start to feel their age in hockey. And so all of those things are very common concerns that players in the NHL or any professional sport would be having. I think there's just that added notion of Shane's control being a factor that teeters it into that disordered eating space. But again, I don't know if Jacob's going to want to touch that because it's so nuanced, and similar to how he handled Shane's autism, each of these things is so personal that I don't know if he'd want to specifically label it at all. And I feel like that's probably what he's going to do. We do in the book get that moment when Shane and Ilya are discovered and Shane spirals and eats a Snickers bar, which I had previously said is like triage, because Shane would be so dysregulated that he reaches for something he has coded as bad in his brain, and that reinforces that Shane's not someone who deviates from a plan. He's dealing with a lot of internal pressure and he's feeling like he's losing control, and the food is a way to showcase that. And it clues the reader into Shane's motivation for the dieting being largely set around his career first. But also, as he spirals in his personal life, it kind of gets enveloped into that as well. And then at the end of the book, he occasionally eats a cheeseburger and feels like he can continue doing that. So again, his personal life falls into a place where he feels he has relative control and happiness over it. Then he loosens up on the diet. I feel like that is saying everything that needs to be said about what his motivations are behind it without Jacob having to explicitly label it as anything. And so I feel like that's probably what is going to be done in the show. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap things up there and continue this on in a future podcast episode. And as always, thank you so much for listening. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it. And if you have a question about season 2 or about the book series that you want me to cover on a future podcast episode, please leave me a message on any of my socials and I will try to get to it in a future recording, because I absolutely love all of the questions I've been getting. There are so many brilliant takes and opinions on there, and it's so fun to interact with people about it on a larger scale. So thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you all in our next chat.